The grieving Princess of Wales was forced to march side by side with her bitterest rival, swallowing her own profound mourning to fake a perfect illusion of unity for a watching world. A brutal charade that she later confessed privately nearly broke her. We all remember those striking images from September 2022, the supposed Fab Four miraculously reunited outside the gates of Windsor Castle, bathed in the soft autumn light as they surveyed the endless sea of floral tributes left for the late Queen Elizabeth II. To the untrained eye, it was a beautiful moment of familial reconciliation, a temporary truce honoring a beloved matriarch who had given her entire life to the service of the nation and the Commonwealth. However, as you and I both know from observing this institution over the decades, the glittering facade presented to the public is very rarely an accurate reflection of the turbulent reality playing out behind those ancient stone walls. The absolute truth of that day is far darker, completely steeped in suspicion, and defined by a suffocating psychological pressure that was placed squarely upon the shoulders of a deeply grieving Catherine. What was sold to the global public as a heartwarming display of unity was, in fact, an orchestrated, desperate maneuver designed to neutralize a very present, highly unpredictable threat residing just down the road at Frogmore Cottage. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe. These videos don't always get recommended, and this way you won't miss the next one. To truly understand the sheer agony of this forced public spectacle, we must first transport ourselves back to the immediate chaotic hours following the passing of Queen Elizabeth II at Balmoral, a period where time itself seemed to violently fracture for the royal family. For Prince William and Catherine, the loss was not merely the passing of a monarch, but the devastating collapse of their family's unwavering anchor, plunging them into a raw, disorienting grief that most of us can barely begin to fathom. Within those frantic first hours, the immense, crushing weight of their new destinies as the Prince and Princess of Wales crashed down upon them, bringing an avalanche of constitutional duties exactly when all they desperately craved was the quiet space to mourn a beloved grandmother. Yet, in the cruelest twist of fate imaginable, this sacred period of mourning was instantly polluted by an incredibly dark, lingering dread that had nothing to do with royal protocol and absolutely everything to do with the fact that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were currently entirely too close to home. The sudden elevation of their status meant William and Catherine could no longer merely exist as grieving relatives. They immediately had to transform into the steadfast protectors of the crown, forced to suppress their own shattering heartache to manage a rapidly escalating crisis that threatened to completely overshadow the late Queen's legacy. The sheer inconvenience of the Sussexes, happening to be on British soil under the guise of their rather self-aggrandizing faux royal charity tour when the Queen passed, was viewed internally not as a comfort, but as an absolute, unmitigated disaster waiting to unfold. Instead of drawing the family together in a quiet circle of shared comfort, the presence of Harry and his wife acted as a toxic catalyst, injecting a highly volatile, completely unpredictable element into an already emotionally devastated household. We must remember that this was a couple who had spent the preceding 2 years lobbing metaphorical grenades over the palace walls from the safety of their Montecito mansion, seemingly determined to dismantle the very institution that was now plunging into deepest mourning. For the newly minted Prince and Princess of Wales, the realization that they would have to navigate the exhausting labyrinthine demands of a state funeral while simultaneously managing the hypersensitive egos of the Sussexes felt like a profoundly unfair punishment. Every single tear shed for the late monarch was accompanied by the sickening, creeping realization that the grieving process would inevitably be hijacked by the relentless, insatiable demands of the Sussex PR machine, leaving William and Catherine absolutely no safe harbor to process their own immense personal loss. Behind the thick, historically impenetrable walls of the royal residences, the atmosphere was thick with a palpable paranoia, transforming the usually dignified corridors into a frantic war room of crisis management and whispered anxieties. According to sources close to palace circles, the late-night discussions between senior aides were fraught with a suffocating tension as every conceivable scenario regarding Harry and Meghan's behavior was meticulously, exhaustively war-gamed by utterly exhausted staff. There was a very real, deeply entrenched fear that any perceived slight, no matter how entirely accidental or fundamentally necessitated by strict constitutional protocol, would be instantly weaponized by the Sussexes and broadcast to their eager cheerleaders across the Atlantic. The air was heavy with the exhausting requirement to meticulously document and perfectly execute every single interaction with the couple, knowing full well that any innocent conversation could be secretly recorded, twisted, and later monetized for a television documentary or a tell-all podcast. This relentless, suffocating paranoia meant that the royal family could not even grieve privately without constantly looking over their shoulders, held entirely hostage by the constant threat of Meghan's carefully curated, perpetual victimhood narrative, completely derailing a historic moment of national mourning. The long-term consequences of mishandling this extremely delicate situation were entirely evident to the firm from the very first moments, presenting a diabolical public relations tightrope that Prince William realized he alone would have to cautiously walk. If the palace chose to entirely exclude the Sussexes from the visible public-facing elements of the mourning period, they would undoubtedly be handing Meghan the exact ammunition she desperately craved, to cry foul and dominate the global news cycle with renewed accusations of royal cruelty. Conversely, allowing them unrestricted, unmonitored access threatened to turn solemn, deeply historic ceremonies into a tacky Hollywood-style media circus, completely detracting from the dignity that King Charles and the wider family were utterly determined to maintain for the late sovereign. The strategic minds within the royal household understood with chilling clarity that this was no longer simply about family dynamics. It was a highly dangerous, high-stakes battle for the absolute narrative control of the century's most significant royal event. Every single decision made in those dark, sleepless hours was calculated to entirely box the Sussexes into a corner, meticulously stripping them of any opportunity to claim they were being marginalized, whilst simultaneously keeping them on the tightest leash imaginable. For Catherine, the reality of this strategic necessity meant facing an agonizing inner conflict that demanded an almost superhuman level of emotional suppression, a sacrifice that truly highlights the immense invisible burdens borne by women marrying into the absolute highest echelons of the institution. As she grappled with the devastating loss of the Queen, a woman who had personally guided, supported, and nurtured her growth into a future Queen consort, Catherine realized with a sickening thud that her own profound emotional needs would have to be entirely abandoned for the greater good of the crown. The deeply unfair, monumental ask being placed squarely upon her elegant shoulders was not merely to endure a public walkabout, but to deliberately, painstakingly project warmth and stoicism next to a woman who had previously, on a global television broadcast, callously attempted to destroy her personal reputation. Internally, her natural, entirely justified instincts for self-preservation and boundary setting were going to war with her unyielding, deeply ingrained sense of duty to her husband and the monarchy, creating a silent, raging torment that was expertly hidden behind her flawlessly composed features. She was being asked to don a heavy psychological armor during the very moment she was most vulnerable, knowingly stepping into the firing line to protect the fragile illusion of stability that a grieving nation so desperately needed to see from its royal family. Standing beside her, Prince William was consumed by a quiet, protective fury, a deeply rooted anger that his beloved wife was being forced into such a psychologically torturous position simply because his brother had chosen to abandon every shred of familial loyalty for the allure of California celebrity. William's grief for his grandmother was entirely compounded by an agonizing, visceral resentment. He knew precisely how much Catherine was suffering in silence, and he absolutely despised the fact that he was the one who had to ask her to endure this completely unforgivable charade. The new Prince of Wales recognized that he had to be ruthless, entirely setting aside his own towering anger to execute a masterstroke of crisis management that would conclusively neutralize the Sussex threat before it could even begin to truly fester on British soil. He understood that the only way to protect King Charles, Catherine, and the entire institution from a looming media disaster was to take complete, immediate control of the chessboard, forcing a scenario where the Sussexes would be entirely unable to dictate the terms of their own participation. This steely resolve, born from a potent mixture of profound grief and fiercely defensive love, would ultimately lead to a decision that would define the entire mourning period and forever seal the fractured fate of the once inseparable royal brothers. As the frantic hours ticked by following the announcement from Balmoral, the realization set in that a massive, uncoordinated crowd was already gathering at the gates of Windsor Castle, turning a place of private mourning into an immediate, highly volatile public focal point that required urgent royal attention. The world's media had firmly established their camps, their lenses hungrily focused on the ancient stones, desperately waiting for the absolute slightest hint of familial discord to splash across the front pages and feed the endless rumor mill surrounding the fractured House of Windsor. The suffocating pressure cooker inside the royal residences had reached its absolute boiling point, making it entirely impossible to simply wait and see what highly inappropriate unilateral PR stunt Harry and Meghan might attempt to execute on their own terms. It became undeniably clear to the Prince of Wales that a preemptive, highly visible strike was required, a calculated, bold move that would assert his absolute authority, trap his brother into compliance, and force the grieving Princess of Wales to take her first agonizing steps into a prolonged living nightmare. As the clock ticked toward the late afternoon that Saturday, the pressure within the walls of Windsor became positively subterranean. Prince William, now the Prince of Wales, found himself in a position that was as much about grand strategy as it was about personal grief. He knew, with the chilling clarity that comes from a lifetime of royal training, that if he did not act, the vacuum would be filled by the Sussexes' own unpredictable PR machinery. There was a very real, very jagged fear that Harry and Meghan might simply turn up at the gates unannounced, perhaps with a Netflix crew in tow or a pre-packaged statement for the American networks, effectively hijacking the nation's mourning for their own brand of televised melodrama. According to a well-placed source, William's decision to organize the joint walkabout was a nuclear option born of necessity, a 2-hour ultimatum delivered with the cold efficiency of a man who has finally realized that blood is not always thicker than the water of public duty. He wasn't reaching out for a hug. He was reaching out to neutralize a tactical threat, wrapping his brother in a diplomatic embrace that was, in reality, a strategic straitjacket. The inner monologue of the prince during those 2 hours was likely a tempest of resentment and calculated resolve. Imagine the sheer, galling irony, having to invite the very people who had spent months disparaging your character into your inner sanctum, simply to prevent them from causing a scene. For William, this wasn't an olive branch. It was a ceasefire agreement written in disappearing ink. He knew he was asking the impossible of Catherine, placing her in a position of extreme psychological discomfort, yet his loyalty to his father's nascent reign and his grandmother's memory overrode his protective instincts as a husband. He was playing a high-stakes game of keep your enemies closer, aware that by extending the invitation, he stripped the Sussexes of their favorite weapon, the claim of being the excluded victims. It was a move of cold-blooded brilliance that left the occupants of Frogmore Cottage with no choice but to comply or risk looking churlish on a global stage, effectively forcing them to play by the palace's rules for the first time in years. The atmosphere, during those frantic 120 minutes, was described by a well-meaning staff member as one of clipped tones and icy professionalism. There were no warm exchanges, no shared tears over the loss of a grandmother. Instead, there were terse phone calls bridging the short but immense physical and emotional distance between Windsor Castle and Frogmore Cottage. The aides, already running on fumes and grief, were reportedly stunned by the sudden pivot. The logistics were a nightmare. Security details had to be synchronized, routes cleared, and the media alerted, all while maintaining a veneer of calm. Behind the scenes, the air was thick with disbelief that this was actually happening. The staff, many of whom had witnessed the Sussexes' departure and the subsequent fallout firsthand, moved with a grim sense of foreboding, knowing they were preparing the stage for a performance that no one actually wanted to give, but everyone was required to watch. The reluctance of the invitation cannot be overstated. It was a move made with gritted teeth and a heavy heart. A source close to palace circles suggests that the communication was handled with the legalistic precision of a treaty negotiation rather than a family chat. There was no "Dear Harry," but rather a series of functional directives. William's primary goal was to ensure that when the four of them appeared, it was on his terms, in his territory, and under his command. He was asserting his new authority as the Prince of Wales, signaling to both his brother and the world that the era of the Sussexes setting the narrative on British soil was officially over. It was a brutal display of soft power, cloaked in the black fabric of mourning, and it left the Sussexes feeling cornered, their usual tactics of truth-telling rendered useless against the sheer gravity of a state in mourning. For the long term, the consequences of this forced invitation were catastrophic for any hope of genuine reconciliation. By using the walkabout as a tool of containment rather than a gesture of grace, William inadvertently signaled that the relationship had moved into a purely transactional phase. The trust was not being rebuilt, it was being managed. This 2-hour ultimatum proved that the only way the two couples could exist in the same space was if one side was essentially coerced into it by public expectation. It set a precedent for future royal events where the Sussexes would be tolerated but managed, a dynamic that has only hardened in the years since. The invitation didn't heal the wound. It merely cauterized it with the heat of public scrutiny, leaving a scar that remains sensitive to this very day. As the deadline approached, the sheer psychological weight on Catherine began to manifest in a stoicism that was almost painful to behold. She was the one who had to stand there and be the bigger person, while the woman who had caused her untold stress stood inches away. Someone close to palace circles noted that the princess seemed to be retreating into a mental fortress, preparing herself for the theater of duty she was about to perform. She knew that every flicker of her eyes, every tightening of her jaw would be analyzed by millions. The pressure was not just to look united, but to look convincingly united. An ask so profound, it felt like a betrayal of her own personal boundaries. She was being asked to lie to the world with her body language, to pretend that the last 2 years of hurt didn't exist, all for the sake of a photograph that she knew would be a lie. The final moments before they stepped out were a blur of cold reality. The black Land Rover was brought round, the security teams took their final positions, and the four royals prepared to face the music. There was no "good luck" or "we can do this" exchanged between the couples. Instead, there was a deafening, hollow silence, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. A source within the inner circle remarked that the tension was so thick it was physically exhausting just to be in the room. The transition from the private agony of the castle to the public spectacle of the long walk was about to begin, and for Catherine it felt like stepping onto a scaffold. The Fab Four were back, but the fab had long since rotted away, leaving only the four strangers bound together by a crown they no longer shared the same vision for. This strategic maneuver by William, while successful in the short term for the palace's image, effectively ended any chance of the brothers ever finding their way back to one another. He had used his power to win the PR battle, but in doing so, he had confirmed to Harry that he was now, first and foremost, the institutional heir, not the protective older brother. The Walkabout was the final act of a dying brotherhood, performed for a public that wanted to believe in fairy tales, while the actors themselves were living through a tragedy of their own making. The stage was set, the gates were about to open, and the most difficult 40 minutes of Catherine's royal life were just seconds away. The transition from the private sanctuary of Windsor's inner sanctum to the glaring visibility of the Long Walk required more than just a change of clothes. For Catherine, it necessitated the donning of a psychological suit of armor so dense it was almost visible to those who knew her best. We must imagine the scene within her dressing suite, a room that should have been a place of quiet reflection for a woman mourning a grandmother-in-law she deeply admired, but which instead became a staging ground for a battle of wills. The physical act of dressing in those somber, sharp-edged mourning blacks was not merely an exercise in royal protocol, but a ritualistic sealing away of her true self. As she fastened each button and adjusted the line of her veil, her inner monologue was likely a repetitive, steely command to maintain control, to suppress the visceral urge to recoil from the task ahead. She was preparing to stand shoulder to shoulder with a woman who had, in her view, callously traded family secrets for American fame, and the mental effort required to transform that justifiable resentment into a mask of regal composure was nothing short of Herculean. The atmosphere within those private quarters during the final minutes of preparation was described by a source within the inner circle as having a chilling, tomb-like silence that felt heavy enough to choke the breath from the room. There was no gentle sisterly encouragement, no shared glances of support with the woman who was supposed to be her sister-in-law. Instead, there was a stark, clinical focus on the optics of the moment, every detail of Catherine's appearance, the precise placement of her hair, the subtle muted tones of her makeup was designed to project an image of unshakable stability, a silent rebuke to the chaotic energy that had followed the Sussexes across the Atlantic. This wasn't about vanity. It was about the strategic use of image as a weapon of defense. A well-meaning staff member observed that the Princess of Wales appeared almost robotic in her movements, a woman who had retreated so far into her sense of duty that her natural warmth had been temporarily replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. She knew that the slightest crack in her facade, a single misplaced look of disdain, or a momentary lapse into visible grief, would be seized upon by the global media and analyzed for signs of weakness or royal bullying. The psychological weight of this self-imposed isolation cannot be overstated, as it represented a profound betrayal of Catherine's own emotional boundaries for the sake of an institution that often demands the impossible from its members. Internally, she was likely grappling with a sense of deep personal violation, knowing that the very person who had caused her so much private distress was now being invited back into her space for a televised performance. This wasn't just a walkabout, it was a public forced reconciliation, a lie she was being asked to tell with every step she took. The long-term consequences of this emotional suppression are a kind of psychological scarring that rarely heals, a hardening of the spirit that occurs when one is repeatedly forced to prioritize the greater good over one's own mental health. For Catherine, that hour in Windsor was the moment she truly realized that her life would forever be a series of such sacrifices, a realization that firmly defined her transition into the role of a future queen who would never again be able to fully trust those outside her most immediate, loyal circle. According to a well-placed source, the tension was so thick during these final preparations that even the most seasoned royal aides felt a sense of impending dread. They watched as the Princess of Wales built her emotional walls, brick by agonizing brick, until she was essentially unreachable to anyone but William. This stoicism was her only defense against the perceived treachery of the Sussexes, a way to ensure that Meghan could not find a single opening to exploit for her own narrative of outsider versus establishment. The atmosphere was one of high-stakes theater, where the stakes were nothing less than the dignity of the British monarchy during its most vulnerable moment in 70 years. Catherine's commitment to the role was absolute, but it came at a staggering personal cost, an exhaustion of the soul that would linger long after the floral tributes had wilted and the cameras had been packed away. She was choosing to be the shield for the crown, knowing full well that the shield often takes the hardest hits and bears the deepest dents. As the time to depart neared, the silence in the room was broken only by the muffled sounds of the security detail coordinating outside, a reminder that the world was waiting with bated breath for a glimpse of the fractured family. Catherine's inner monologue during these final seconds was likely a frantic tally of the protocols she had to observe, a mental checklist designed to keep the reality of the situation at bay. She had to remember where to stand, how to tilt her head, when to offer a sympathetic smile to the crowd, all while maintaining a safe, icy distance from the woman standing just a few feet away. The sheer cognitive load of managing these conflicting demands while in the throes of genuine grief is a feat of mental endurance that few people could survive without breaking. Yet, as she looked in the mirror one last time, there was no sign of the turmoil beneath the surface. There was only the Princess of Wales, ready to perform the hardest role of her life. The long-term impact of this theater of duty on the relationship between the two couples was definitive, as it proved to Catherine that there was no longer any room for authenticity in her interactions with the Sussexes. The Walkabout didn't just highlight the rift, it codified it into a permanent state of Cold War. By donning her psychological armor, Catherine was signaling that she was done trying to bridge the gap. She was now simply managing the fallout. This shift from family member to institutional guardian marked a turning point in her royal career, one where the soft power of her personality was secondary to the hard requirements of her position. The world saw a united front, but those within the inner circle saw a woman who had been pushed to her absolute limit and had emerged on the other side with a heart that had been permanently chilled toward her brother-in-law and his wife. Behind the scenes, the staff moved with a quiet, reverent caution, sensing the immense gravity of what the princess was being asked to do. A source close to palace circles remarked that there was a collective breath-hold among the household as the car was called for. They knew they were witnesses to a historical moment of profound personal sacrifice, one that would be written about in biographies for decades to come, yet the woman at the center of it was utterly alone in her struggle. The Fab Four were about to be reunited for the cameras, but the reality was a fragmented, broken assembly of four individuals who shared a name but no longer shared a soul. For Catherine, the Walkabout was a trial by fire, a test of her loyalty to the crown that she passed with flying colors, but at the expense of a piece of her own peace. The long-term consequences for the monarchy were equally significant, as Catherine's performance that day set the standard for how the family would deal with the Sussex problem moving forward, with impeccable frozen politeness that offered nothing for the critics to latch onto, but provided no warmth for the exiles to bask in. This strategy of gray rocking on a global scale began in that Windsor dressing room. It was the birth of a new, more resilient Catherine, one who understood that in the game of royal survival, the mask is often more important than the face behind it. As she stepped out to meet William and begin the journey to the gates, she wasn't just walking toward a crowd. She was walking into the history books as the woman who saved the face of the monarchy, even as her own heart was breaking under the weight of the lie. The physical act of entering that black Land Rover was perhaps the first moment the four royals truly realized the magnitude of the theatrical performance they were about to deliver. A journey that, despite being remarkably short in distance, felt to those inside like a descent into a psychological abyss. For the Prince and Princess of Wales, the interior of the vehicle offered no respite from the crushing weight of their grief. Instead, it became a vacuum of absolute, suffocating silence that a well-placed source later described as being so thick it was almost audible. For those few agonizing minutes, roughly 150 seconds that stretched into an eternity, there was not a single word exchanged between the two couples, no polite inquiries about the flight from California, and certainly no shared memories of the grandmother they were supposedly there to honor. Catherine sat with a rigid, crystalline composure, her eyes fixed firmly ahead, her entire being focused on maintaining the mental fortress she had built to survive the next 40 minutes of public exposure. Beside her, William was a statue of suppressed fury and duty, while in the rear, the Sussexes were reportedly left to stew in the cold, unyielding reality of their own isolation within the family they had so publicly maligned. This silence was not merely the result of a lack of things to say, but a strategic, protective barrier erected by the Waleses to prevent any further emotional contamination from a couple they now viewed with the deepest suspicion. Someone close to palace circles noted that Catherine, in particular, was acutely aware that any stray word or gesture of warmth could be misconstrued or, worse, recorded and used as fodder for future media ventures by the pair in the back seat. Her inner monologue during that ride was likely a relentless rehearsal of the role she was about to play, the stoic, grieving future queen who would not allow a single crack to appear in her armor. She was essentially performing grey rocking on a grand institutional scale, depriving the Sussexes of the emotional oxygen they required to fuel their narrative of being the misunderstood, rejected outsiders. The atmosphere inside the car was one of profound, unbridgeable distance, a physical manifestation of the fact that while they were sharing the same leather seats, they were inhabiting entirely different universes of loyalty and intent. When the vehicle finally came to a halt at the Cambridge gate, the transition from that icy silence to the deafening roar of the gathered crowds was a jolt that required every ounce of the princess's professional discipline. As the doors were opened by the waiting staff, there was a momentary, awkward dithering among the four royals, a lack of coordination that a well-meaning staff member later attributed to the fact that they hadn't actually spoken to each other about how they would dismount. Catherine emerged first, her chin held at an angle that body language experts later described as a display of sheer dominance and showing who was boss, though in reality it was likely the only way she could keep herself from collapsing under the weight of the moment. She stepped onto the gravel, not as a sister-in-law, but as the Princess of Wales, her movements sharp, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the natural easy warmth that usually characterized her public engagements. This was a rescue mission for the crown's dignity, and she was the lead operative, moving with a chillingly effective grace that left no room for the kind of messy, emotional grandstanding that often followed in Meghan's wake. The contrast between the two women as they began the walkabout was nothing short of a study in cultural and psychological opposition, a divide that the British public watched with bated, judgmental breath. While Catherine moved with the practiced, quiet dignity of a woman who understands that true mourning requires no performance, Meghan appeared to be a woman waiting for her cues, frequently flicking her hair and glancing toward the cameras in a way that suggested a deep underlying anxiety. A source behind closed doors observed that the Duchess seemed hyper-aware of her own image, her American energy, all wide eyes and practiced empathy, clashing violently with the somber, quintessentially British atmosphere of the Windsor morning. For Catherine, watching her rival attempt to charm a crowd that had spent the last 2 years reading about her alleged bullying of the very woman standing next to her must have been a form of psychological torture. Yet, she didn't falter. She focused on the mourners, on the children holding Paddington bears, and on the flowers, using the public's genuine grief as a shield to block out the presence of the woman she now considered her greatest personal adversary. As they moved down the long walk, the tactical separation of the two couples was a stroke of quiet genius that allowed the Waleses to maintain their dignity while still fulfilling the requirement of a united front. William and Catherine took one side of the road, while Harry and his wife took the other, ensuring that their physical interactions were kept to an absolute negligible minimum. This separation created two distinct atmospheres. On one side, a sense of traditional, stable royal duty. On the other, a frantic attempt to recapture the people's princess magic that had long since evaporated for the Sussexes on British soil. A source within the inner circle remarked that the distance between the two couples was a physical representation of the great divide that now defined the family, a gap that no amount of shared floral viewing could ever hope to close. For the 40 minutes they spent among the people, the Fab Four were essentially two rival factions engaged in a silent, high-stakes competition for the public's favor, with Catherine's unyielding stoicism ultimately winning the day through its sheer, undeniable authenticity. The long-term consequences of this walkabout were cemented in the moment the four royals finally turned back toward the car, the performance ending as abruptly as it had begun. The facade of unity had been successfully maintained for the cameras, but the damage to the internal relationships was now permanent and, in many ways, terminal. Catherine's private admission to a senior royal that this was one of the hardest things she had ever had to do was not just a comment on the stress of the day, but a declaration of the end of her patience. She had been forced to share her grief with someone she felt had commodified it, and that was a betrayal she would never forget. The walkabout proved that the Crown could still demand the impossible from its members, but it also proved that Catherine had transitioned from a supportive spouse into a formidable institutional power in her own right, one who would never again allow herself to be cornered into such a toxic compromise. As they returned to the vehicle and the gates of Windsor Castle finally swung shut behind them, the silence returned, but this time it was even heavier, laden with the knowledge that the charade was over. A well-placed source noted that the second the car doors closed and they were shielded from public view, the masks did not just slip. They were discarded with a visceral sense of relief and revulsion. There were no well-dones or sighs of shared accomplishment. There was only the cold, hard reality that they had survived the hour and that they would likely never have to do it again. The Windsor Walkabout remains a masterclass in royal artifice, a 40-minute illusion that served its purpose for the history books while simultaneously ensuring that the four people at its center would never truly be a family again. Catherine had done her duty. She'd protected the king and the memory of the queen, but she had paid for it with a piece of her soul that would never quite be the same. The heavy door of the Land Rover finally swung open, and with it, the suffocating silence of the interior was instantly replaced by the raw, chaotic energy of thousands of mourners and the blinding glare of the world's media. For Catherine, stepping onto that gravel was less a public engagement and more a transition into a highly pressurized, surreal theatrical environment where every micro-expression would be transmitted to billions in high definition. You and I can only imagine the sheer jolt of adrenaline that must have coursed through her, a physiological surge designed to mask a bone-deep exhaustion and a heart that was already grieving. According to a source within the inner circle, this was the moment Catherine issued a strict internal command to herself. She would be flawless, she would be impenetrable, and above all, she would not give the woman standing just a few feet away a single millimeter of vulnerability to exploit for her own narrative. The atmosphere was thick with a stunned, audible gasp from the crowd, a collective realization that the impossible was happening, creating a tension so palpable that one could almost feel the weight of it pressing down on the shoulders of the four royals as they took their first tentative steps into the limelight. As she moved toward the first bank of floral tributes, Catherine's focus was a masterclass in regal compartmentalization, a psychological feat where she effectively locked away her personal distaste for the Sussexes to serve the immediate needs of the crown. She knew, with a clarity born of years of training, that the Fab Four label was being resurrected by every news ticker on the planet in real time, and her role was to ensure that the image of unity remained unsullied by the reality of the rift. Internally, there was a cold, calculated resolve to remain the anchor of the group, providing the public with the stability they craved, while Harry and his wife appeared, at least to the discerning eye, to be struggling with the sheer gravity of a British state in mourning. A well-placed source noted that while Catherine's sorrow was quiet and deeply dignified, there was an underlying steel in her posture that signaled she was the one truly in command of the stage. She was not merely viewing flowers. She was reclaiming the territory of Windsor for the monarchy, ensuring that the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II was not overshadowed by the performative anxieties of the couple from California. Across the divide of the walkway, the Sussexes presented a starkly different energy, one that felt jarringly out of sync with the somber, respectful mood of the Berkshire afternoon. While Prince William and Catherine navigated the crowd with an innate, quiet grace, Harry and Meghan appeared hyper-aware of the cameras, their movements occasionally betraying a sense of self-conscious, almost theatrical desperation to be seen as the most empathetic figures on the field. To the audience we know so well, those who value the understated stoic nature of British duty, the Sussexes' display of American-style mourning, complete with frequent glances for the lens and over-earnest hand-holding, felt profoundly performative. Someone close to palace circles remarked that the contrast was positively blinding, as the Waleses performed the actual work of comforting the nation, while the other pair seemed more focused on curating their own visual legacy for a future documentary. For Catherine, having to witness this calculated charm offensive while standing in the shadow of her own genuine grief was a psychological burden of the highest order, yet she refused to let a single flicker of disdain cross her face. The pressure of the moment was amplified by the sheer volume of the international press, whose lenses were searching for the slightest hint of a cold shoulder or an icy glare that could be weaponized into a War of the Waleses headline. Behind the scenes, the palace staff were watching from the wings with a sense of high-stakes anxiety, knowing that a single slip-up would dismantle the carefully constructed illusion of family peace they had spent hours preparing. The atmosphere was one of a high-wire act performed without a net, where the physical proximity of the two couples was a constant source of potential combustion that required the Waleses to be twice as vigilant. A source behind closed doors described the scene as theater of the most exhausting kind, where the actors were acutely aware that the play was a lie, but the audience needed it to be true to begin their own process of healing. Catherine, in particular, bore the brunt of this theatrical requirement, acting as the silent, beautiful guarantor of the family's integrity, while her internal monologue was likely counting down the seconds until she could retreat behind the safety of the castle walls once more. The long-term consequences of this 40-minute performance were profound, as it successfully created a set of iconic yet entirely fabricated images that would define the funeral period and protect the early days of King Charles's reign from the taint of scandal. These photographs showing the four royals in a unified front served as a vital piece of national propaganda, reassuring a grieving public that the institution was larger than the petty quarrels of its members. However, for Catherine, the cost of providing that reassurance was a permanent hardening of her stance toward the Sussexes. She had seen firsthand how they could weaponize a moment of national tragedy for their own image. The Walkabout proved that while the Fab Four could still be summoned for the cameras, the reality of that partnership was dead and buried, replaced by a cold, functional necessity that would never again be mistaken for genuine affection. It was a victory for the Crown's public relations, but a final devastating blow to the idea of a family reunited, leaving Catherine with the knowledge that her duty would forever require her to share the stage with those who had tried to tear her world down. The physical choreography of those 40 minutes was nothing short of a tactical masterclass in containment, a calculated separation that allowed the two couples to inhabit the same space without ever truly acknowledging the radioactive presence of the other. As they moved down the long walk, William and Catherine took the right side of the crowd, while Harry and his wife took the left, a maneuver that ensured their paths would never cross and their interactions would remain precisely zero. For Catherine, this distance was her only solace, a few yards of gravel acting as a much-needed DMZ between her and the woman who had caused her so much private anguish. Her inner monologue during this time was likely focused on the sheer mechanics of the walk, engaging with the mourners, accepting the bouquets, and maintaining that perfect stoic tilt of the head, all while being acutely aware of the Montecito performance unfolding just across the road. She knew that every second she spent on that pavement was a second stolen from her own private grief, a sacrifice made to ensure that the Sussexes didn't turn a national tragedy into a self-serving media circus. Watching from the other side, the contrast in energy was, frankly, jarring for anyone with a discerning eye for royal tradition. While Catherine moved with a quiet, almost magnetic dignity that felt entirely natural to the setting, Meghan appeared to be operating under a different set of stage directions entirely. According to a source behind closed doors, the Duchess was visibly vibrating with a nervous, overeager energy, frequently adjusting her hair and scanning the crowd for the most advantageous camera angles. There was a sense of a woman trying far too hard to recapture a people's princess magic that had long since been extinguished by her own public broadsides against the family. To those of us who have watched these performances for decades, it was clear that Meghan was playing to a very specific global audience, her micro-expressions fluctuating between practiced empathy and a telltale anxiety that suggested she knew she was on hostile ground. Catherine, by comparison, didn't need to perform. Her sorrow was etched in her silence, a stark contrast to the performative, wide-eyed listening that seemed to be the order of the day for the Sussexes. The atmosphere during this prolonged walkabout was described by those close to the security detail as being profoundly disjointed, as if two entirely different events were happening simultaneously on the same stretch of road. On one side, there was the quiet, respectful exchange between a future queen and a grieving public. On the other, a somewhat frantic attempt by the Sussexes to re-establish their brand in the very heart of the institution they had sought to diminish. A source within the inner circle noted that the air between the two groups was physically heavy, a cold draft that seemed to follow them down the long walk regardless of the autumn sun. The public, while largely polite, was not blind to the tension. Many observers later commented on the visible stiffness in Harry's shoulders and the way William never once turned his head to check on his brother's progress. It was a parade of strangers, bound by a common name, and the sheer effort required to maintain the illusion of a family united was visibly draining the life out of the Waleses as the minutes dragged on. In the long term, the consequences of this 40-minute charade were far more damaging than the palace might have hoped, as the global public began to spot the tiny, irrepressible cracks in the facade almost immediately. High-definition lenses and slow-motion replays allowed the world to dissect every micro-expression, revealing the icy glares and the deliberate avoidance that the palace had tried so hard to mask with floral tributes. The realization began to dawn on the British public, and indeed on many of you watching at home, that the physical distance between the couples during that walk was merely a metaphor for a vast, unbridgeable emotional chasm. It proved that even in the face of the greatest personal and national loss, the wounds inflicted by the Sussexes were too deep to be healed by a simple walkabout. This event didn't signal a reconciliation. It signaled the definitive end of the Fab Four as an idea, leaving the audience with the sobering truth that the monarchy was now a house divided against itself, performing a play for an audience that was finally starting to see through the costume. The final perfunctory waves were given. The last forced smiles were offered to the flickering lenses of the world's press, and with a collective, almost audible exhale of suppressed tension, the four royals turned their backs on the long walk and retreated toward the waiting vehicle. For Catherine, that walk back to the black Land Rover was perhaps more grueling than the public display itself. It was the moment the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow realization of the sheer psychological price she had just paid. Every step away from the crowd and toward the heavy iron gates was a step back into a reality that had been permanently altered, a reality where family was no longer a sanctuary but a battlefield that required constant, exhausting vigilance. Internally, she was likely grappling with a profound sense of relief that the charade was over, yet this was poisoned by the knowledge that she had just participated in a lie that would be broadcast into every home on the planet. According to a source behind closed doors, the Princess of Wales appeared to physically shrink into herself the moment she was no longer the center of the public's gaze, her regal posture momentarily faltering under the weight of an emotional crash that had been 40 minutes in the making. The moment those heavy car doors slammed shut, severing the connection between the royals and the mourning public, the performance didn't just end. It vanished with a visceral, chilling finality. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere shifted instantly from a staged, fragile unity to a toxicity so thick it felt like a physical presence, a suffocating fog of unspoken grievances and profound mutual distrust. There were no words of shared accomplishment, no "well done" for navigating a difficult moment. Instead, there was only the sound of breathing and the soft hum of the engine as they began the short journey back to the private quarters of Windsor. A well-meaning staff member later remarked that the transition was shattering, as if the four individuals had been suddenly unplugged from a power source, leaving them sitting in a dark, silent vacuum. For Catherine, the silence was a mercy, a brief window where she no longer had to pretend that the woman sitting across from her hadn't spent the last 2 years attempting to dismantle her reputation and the very institution she lived to serve. She sat in her corner of the car, eyes fixed on the passing greenery, her mind likely racing through the long-term implications of what had just transpired, a temporary truce that felt more like a surrender to the necessity of public relations than a genuine movement toward peace. Prince William, for his part, sat with his jaw set in a line of unyielding steel, his inner monologue likely a tempest of protective fury and cold, strategic calculation. He had achieved what he set out to do. He had neutralized the threat of a Sussex-led media circus during the Queen's mourning period, but at the cost of his wife's peace of mind and the final lingering shreds of his own patience. He knew that the images captured that day would serve the monarchy's interests, providing a much-needed narrative of stability for his father's new reign, yet the price of that victory felt almost too high to bear. A source within the inner circle noted that William's focus was entirely on Catherine, his quiet concern for her well-being, a sharp contrast to the indifference he displayed toward the couple in the back seat. He recognized that this had been a one-time-only maneuver, a desperate bridge built of straw and paper that could never support the weight of actual ongoing family life. The realization that he had been forced to use his own wife as a shield against his brother's unpredictability was a realization that would leave a permanent, bitter residue on his soul, hardening his resolve to ensure that such a compromise would never be asked of her again. Across the divide of the luxury interior, the Sussexes were reportedly left to contemplate the reality that their American-style charm offensive had been effectively checked by the icy professionalism of the Waleses. If they had hoped for a private moment of reconciliation or a crack in the icy facade, they were met with a wall of polite institutional indifference that was far more damaging than an outright argument. To a source behind closed doors, it was clear that the olive branch they had accepted was, in reality, a meticulously constructed cage that had successfully contained them for 40 minutes, stripping them of their ability to dictate the terms of their own participation. Harry's usual hypersensitivity to his family's coldness was likely peaking in that silent car, yet there was no room for his grievances in a vehicle occupied by a woman who had just sacrificed her own mourning to facilitate his wife's presence. The dismissive, almost clinical atmosphere inside the Land Rover served as a final crushing confirmation that while they shared the name Windsor, they no longer shared the bond of family. They were merely two rival factions traveling toward an inevitable, permanent separation. The long-term consequences of this retreat behind the walls were defined by a quiet, unspoken pact between William and Catherine, that the Windsor Walkabout would be the final act of its kind, the last time they would ever allow their personal boundaries to be breached for the sake of a Sussex-shaped illusion. This was the moment the never again policy was effectively born, a realization that the risk of such proximity far outweighed any potential PR benefit for the crown. For Catherine, the emotional scar of that day became a permanent part of her royal identity, a constant reminder that in the game of modern monarchy, the greatest threats often come from within the inner circle. A well-placed source suggests that this experience was the catalyst for her to step fully into her power as a future queen, one who would no longer be a passive participant in these forced family moments, but would instead become the chief architect of her own emotional safety and the sanctity of her household. The Fab Four didn't just die that afternoon. They were ceremoniously buried beneath the gravel of the long walk, and as the car reached its destination, the finality of that burial was understood by everyone inside. As the vehicle finally pulled to a stop and the four royals went their separate ways, the Sussexes toward the temporary sanctuary of Frogmore, the Waleses toward the relative peace of Adelaide Cottage, the spell of unity was not just broken, it was shattered. There was no lingering on the doorstep, no shared tea to decompress from the day's events. There was only a swift, perfunctory parting that felt more like the end of a difficult business meeting than a family gathering. A well-placed source noted that the separation was instantaneous, with the two couples moving in opposite directions the second the doors were opened, as if they were being repelled by a powerful magnetic force. This was the true, darkest secret of the 2022 Walkabout, that the only thing more difficult than the walk itself was the realization that it had achieved absolutely nothing in the way of healing. For Catherine, the day ended not with a sense of peace, but with a grim, weary clarity that the war with the Sussexes was far from over. It had simply moved into a new, more dangerous phase of cold, calculated distance. The truth, as it so often does in the shadow of the palace, began to seep out not through a formal announcement, but through the quiet, measured leaks of those who had witnessed the Princess of Wales's slow, agonizing recovery from that afternoon. We eventually learned, through the meticulous work of royal biographers and the whispers of well-placed sources, that Catherine later confessed to a senior member of the family that the Windsor Walkabout was, in her own words, one of the absolute hardest things she had ever been forced to endure. This wasn't merely a comment on the heat of the day or the length of the walk. It was a devastating admission of the psychological trauma of being cornered into a public performance with the very people who were systematically attempting to dismantle her life's work. A source close to palace circles suggests that the lingering trauma of that day stayed with Catherine for months, a persistent, chilling reminder that her position required her to be a sacrificial lamb on the altar of public relations whenever the Sussexes decided to darken the doorstep. The realization that the Fab Four illusion had been successfully resurrected by the media, based entirely on a lie she had been forced to tell, felt to her like a profound personal betrayal, one that left her feeling deeply exposed and fundamentally unsupported by the circumstances. The atmosphere in the weeks following the funeral was one of a slow, vindictive clarity, as the palace began to reckon with the fact that Catherine's immense sacrifice had bought them only a temporary, fragile peace. According to a source within the inner circle, the mood behind closed doors shifted from a frantic management of the Sussexes to a cold, steely determination to ensure that the princess was never again placed in such a compromising position. There was a sense of profound regret among senior aides that the 2-hour ultimatum had required so much of Catherine's emotional capital, especially as it became increasingly clear that Harry and Meghan had no intention of reciprocating the gesture of unity. The air was thick with a new kind of resolve, a realization that the days of keeping the peace through personal sacrifice were over, and that the Waleses would henceforth prioritize their own mental fortress over the optics of familial reconciliation. This shift was a direct consequence of the Windsor Walkabout, serving as the definitive end of the palace's willingness to entertain the Sussexes' demands for inclusion on their own self-serving terms. For Catherine, the internal monologue of the months that followed was likely defined by a hardening of her spirit and a total evaporation of whatever lingering sympathy she might have held for her brother-in-law. She had seen with chilling clarity that the couple from California were entirely willing to stand beside her and smile for the cameras, while simultaneously preparing a fresh onslaught of truth-telling in the form of a Netflix documentary and a memoir. A well-meaning staff member observed that the Princess of Wales emerged from that period with a newfound impenetrable guard, a woman who had seen the absolute limit of her duty and decided she would never cross it again. The long-term consequences of this realization cannot be overstated. It was the moment Catherine ceased to be a peacemaker and became a protector, a shift that has fundamentally altered the power dynamics within the House of Windsor. She learned that in the face of absolute disloyalty, the only effective weapon is a cold, dignified distance, a strategy of gray rocking that she has employed with devastating effectiveness ever since. The Windsor Walkabout now stands in the history books as the definitive end of the illusion, a masterclass in royal duty that simultaneously served as the final act of a dying brotherhood. When we look back at those photographs, we no longer see a family reunited. We see a strategic containment, a 40-minute charade that masked a deep, unforgivable personal agony for the woman at its center. A source behind closed doors notes that the faked unity of 2022 is now viewed internally as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the staggering cost of trying to maintain a facade with those who have already left the building. For the monarchy, the event was a success in the shortest possible term, but for the individuals involved, it was a moment of profound fracturing that could never be repaired. It proved that the crown could indeed demand the impossible, but it also proved that even the most loyal of servants has a breaking point, and Catherine reached hers on that gravel path in Windsor. Ultimately, the gravity of that afternoon lies in the silence that has followed it, a silence that speaks far more loudly than any tabloid headline or Netflix trailer. The Princess of Wales stood her ground, did her duty, and protected the institution during its darkest hour, but she did so at a personal cost that we are only just beginning to truly understand. It was a victory of the will over the heart, a demonstration of the brutal weight of the crown and the staggering personal price of duty when faced with absolute, unyielding disloyalty. Catherine's performance was a triumph for the institution, but a tragedy for the family, leaving us to wonder how much more can be asked of a woman whose only crime was her unshakable commitment to a role that demands everything and gives back only the cold comfort of duty. The memory of that walk serves as a permanent reminder of the stakes involved in this ongoing royal drama, a theater where the costumes are real, the grief is profound, and the enemies are often found sitting in the same car. We must reflect on the sheer resilience of a woman who can walk through such fire and emerge with her dignity not just intact, but enhanced, even as the world around her crumbles into gossip and intrigue. It is a sobering thought, is it not? That the most photographed moment of unity in recent royal history was, in fact, the moment the family finally, irrevocably fell apart. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write. And if you value this unvarnished look at the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth. Would you like me to move on to the next topic on our list, or is there a specific detail of the Windsor aftermath you'd like to dissect further?